Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first of two video recorded lectures that set the scene for the weekend retreat on November the 6th and 7th. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional lands referred to as Treaty 4 territory, and that the city of Regina and the University of Regina are located on Treaty 4 territory, the original lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect and honor the treaties that were made on all territories. We acknowledge the harms and the mistakes of the past, and we are committed to move forward in partnership with Indigenous nations in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. We would also like to recognize and give our sincere thanks to the University of Regina Faculty of Education for funding and support, to Kerry Chapel and the Creativity and Emergent Education Futures Network for their ongoing support, and to Willow Ioga, our research assistant, who has also helped organize the weekend retreat, and for her facilitation of technology and moderation of the virtual space. The purpose of the first session is to introduce the key ideas of coloniality and d/coloniality. All subsequent sessions are based on this foundation. We would like to start by introducing ourselves. We have chosen the medium of poetry to explore our identities, that is, our positionalities and subjectivities. By this, we mean how we position ourselves in society and how society positions us. So I will start with my poem. It's titled Forsaken. Before I start, I'd just like to give you some translation of vocabulary. Karibu means welcome. Kwaheri means goodbye. Uhuru means freedom. And Ujamaa means brotherhood or socialism. And these words are all from Swahili and from the country that I was born in. Kwaheri German East Africa, Kwaheri Great Britain, Kwaheri Tanganyika, Uhuru na Ujamaa, Karibu Tanzania. Nationalization, loss of land, homes and business, the loss of family, the loss of relationships, the loss of dignity, the shame of ultimatums, a start of the brown flight to liminal spaces, to diasporian existences anew in lands belonging to another. The son of the only son, the kind and gentle one, the favored, loved and smart one, this brother mine. Ears deaf, eyes blind, tongues torn out of mouths, speaking in whispers, money changing hands, removed in stealth for a good education, a better life. From the frying pan into the line of fire, the start of the brown flight to liminal spaces, a diasporian existence in the lands of the last colonizer. A slate-colored sky, soft mist in the distance, enveloping the valley that surrounds us. At boarding school in Nairobi, in my dormitory, sitting on the bed with knees bent, Nermin and I learning to shave the hair off our legs. The phone rings in the distance. Fatu, it's for you, long distance, hurry. With puffs of shaving cream over parts of my leg, razor blade held tightly in hand, happy, running, thinking, Gantia, Chevro, Cara biscuits, what can I possibly order from home? Answering the phone with anticipation, the mother says, to Canada I go, I'll see you when I see you. What about me, Ma? Goodbye, Fatma. The mist closing in, 13 years old and forsaken in a country not of my own. The start of the brown flight to liminal spaces. A diasporian existence in the land of another, the start of the brown flight to lands, spaces and places anew, to a land rightfully belonging to another, Turtle Island. In this land that I now reside, white settlers shifting ownership of blame. Brown bodies complicit in harming the first peoples, yet brown bodies also categorized as inconsequential, nuisance, different, exotic, and thus relegated to the margins, a diasporian existence in the land of another. Learning the limits of white-bounded spaces, living with symbolic, histopolitical, and geographical boundary existence. Navigating across this borderlands when permitted, learning to navigate to new margins. 1 step forward, 2 steps back, dancing, always dancing on the margins. Learning to know my place in spaces in between, in a land belonging to another, Turtle Island, not white settler, not First Nations, not colonizer, but previously colonized. White settlers colonizing brown bodies anew, complex hybridized identities, caught between the binary, not white settler, not First Nations. Diasporan colonized brown bodies made invisible, except when white settlers need to shift the blame.
My poem is called Who Am I? Who am I if not land? Who am I if not sea? Who am I if not sky? Who am I if not tree? Who am I if not dog? Who am I if not twin? Who am I if not spirit? I am land in my walking across Exmoor or the dunes at Willicombe. I am sea in my wetsuit on my board. I am sky lying on my back in the garden of my childhood. I am tree climbing with my brother Peter. I am dog playing a biting game with Harry. I am twin in everything. I am twin in and with spirit. I am all these things, but what if I was not? What if walking, boogie boarding, staring at the sky, climbing, playing, being twin? What if being the spirit of these were taken away from me? Who would I be then?
In our poems, we focus on those aspects of our identities that are in relationship with the land. Mignolo refers to this as a locus of enunciation, and Gros-Forguel as the geopolitical and body political location of the subject that speaks. Understanding the location from where we speak is, as you will be aware, central to any social justice and de/colonial work. However, it is one thing to understand this at an intellectual level, and another to act on this understanding to embody another way of being. For those of us who have been socialized from birth into a colonial way of being and doing, we unconsciously embody coloniality in everything we do and how we relate in and to the world, how we relate to each other, how we relate to the land, and how we relate to other than human and more than human beings. Even the phrase relate to is colonial, because it places the self in the subject position and the being that one is relating to in the object position. A decentered way of expressing this might be to consider how we are in relation with the land, each other, and with other than human and more than human beings. Being in relation with positions everyone in that relationship as knowing objects. As Audre Lorde famously said, you cannot dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. Continuing with this metaphor, the Decolonial Futures Collective have spent time constructing the house that modernity built, and the ontological nature of any move to decolonize is expressed in their statement that affirming our responsibility to other beings and our entanglement with everything cannot bring us to a different place if we remain wedded to the promises that have led us to keep reproducing the same harmful house over and over again. In what follows, our intention is not so much to talk about coloniality, but to explore the ways in which we are colonial, how our identities are enmeshed in the colonial world system, and how this influences all our educational relationships. So Benedict Arnold developed the idea of a nation as an imagined community. And Anderson argues that a nation is socially constructed. That is, it is imagined by people who perceive themselves to be part of that national community. What it means to be part of that national community, the sense of belonging, is imagined, because all members of the community will never meet all other members. However, they will imagine themselves as if and behave as if they are a cohesive community. This makes it possible to perceive the nation and thus national identity as a deep horizontal comradeship which knits or binds all citizens together, irrespective of their class, color, or race, despite actual inequalities that exist within the nation. The nation as an imagined community is political in two key aspects. Number one, firstly, in its limitedness or boundedness, that is, in its legal structures that show the limits of the social and the physical boundaries of the nation state and its citizenship. Secondly, in its sovereignty, that is, in its national legal systems and structures of governance that govern all aspects of public life. For example, as teachers, we're all governed by the Ministry of Education, school boards, and so on. This brings us to the question of how society and government work together to produce the nation as an imagined community.
So how does a nation conceptualize who it is? Who gets to define national identity? And in the imaginary that is produced, who is included, who is excluded, and why? To answer some of these questions, we need to go back in history to a time when European nations were being formed, when their formation was done in relation to the processes of colonization and to the role of print media in these processes. The European printing press was invented around 1440 in Germany. The effect on mass communication was revolutionary, enabling the mass production of books and the rapid dissemination of knowledge throughout Europe. The European colonial project began later in the same century, around 1490, with the Portuguese expansion into the South Atlantic and towards the Indian Ocean, and with Spain's so-called discovery of America. Of course, describing the places encountered as discoveries is a very Eurocentric perspective. The British started to establish overseas colonies in the 16th century, with the British Empire being at its height from the mid-19th to the mid-20th centuries. During this period, the British came to know who they are by encountering who they are not. And the process of colonization both reflected and produced colonial discourses that informed the imagined community and notions of citizenship and national identity. A core construct that was inherent in colonial discourses was the creation of a clear distinction between self and other. This self-other dichotomy positioned the self in opposition to, rather than in relation with, the other. Narratives about the lands, peoples, and places encountered were sent back to Europe and disseminated to the masses via print media. Differences were exaggerated through the use of stereotypes, which informed the imagined national identity through binary oppositions such as like, unlike, civilized, uncivilized, developed, undeveloped, modern, backward. By their very nature, all national identities are subject to stereotypes, such as the one in the image on the left here. It's part of a presentation, I Am Canadian, Canadian Identity Grade 9, that is available on SlideShare. But in this slide, the only two images of people are those of white men, and they are identified with the legal system and the media, two of the key structures that perpetuate coloniality. What does this say about the Canadian imaginary?
So this diagram shows how education is part of a system of being and knowing that starts with government and the nation as an imagined community, the influence of which is funneled down to the scale of classroom and interactions between students and teachers. This system is one in which students are categorized according to race, ethnicity, and ability. Knowledge is categorized into subjects. The curriculum is categorized into different levels and areas, all against apparently neutral criteria that are the assumed norm. It is this norm that we will argue is colonial and part of what Grossberg-Well calls a colonial world system. the influence of government and how a nation imagines itself is all too evident in the coming slide.
So this image is an illustration from an article written in 2017 titled "The Canadian Experiment. Is this the world's first post-national country?" And it was in the Guardian newspaper written by Canadian Charles Foran. The opening paragraph states, "When Justin Trudeau said there is no core identity, no mainstream in Canada, he was articulating a uniquely Canadian philosophy that some find bewildering, even reckless, but could represent a radical new model of nationhood." This view is backed up by a discussion of what has become known as Canadian exceptionalism. That is, the idea that Canadians welcome immigrants with open arms and an open heart, and an idea connected to the mosaic, as opposed to melting pot, conception of multiculturalism. This idea, the article goes on to say, is a half-century-old intellectual project born of the country's awakening from colonial slumber, and the claim that, in some sense, we have always been thinking differently about this continent-wide landmass, using ideas borrowed from indigenous societies. Acknowledgement of the violences of colonialism is limited to a single sentence, which is immediately followed by a caveat that repositions settler Canadians in a positive light. That welcome was often betrayed, in particular during the late 19th and 20th centuries, when settler Canada did profound harm to Indigenous people. But if the imbalance remains, so too does the influence, the model of another way of being and another way of belonging. The image itself centers the white male settler Canadian in the form of Justin Trudeau, who looks out benevolently while surrounded by a diverse immigrant population. As an image, it completely erases the Indigenous population, while the text relegates the violence of colonialism on Indigenous peoples to the past. Furthermore, it ignores the growing incidences of racism and violence against immigrants of colour. As an imaginary, it is therefore a whitewashed liberal one that evades facing the uncomfortable truths that are also part of Canadian identity. As André Demise states, Canada is also a nation that has been condemned by the United Nations and Amnesty International for our callous and discriminatory treatment of Indigenous people, our willingness to lock up immigrants indefinitely, even those whose status was made precarious by our changing the rules after they arrived legally, and our mining firms stand accused of human rights atrocities in Central America and Africa, including the rape and murder of local protesters, and we continue to sell arms to despotic regimes who use our weapons against their own people.
So in this slide, we're taking you back in time to look at the history of colonialism and how it provided the foundation for the British imaginary. In his book, English and the Discourses of Colonialism, Alistair Pennycook argues that colonialism is not only a period in which European colonized nations, cultures were imposed on colonized nations, but also a period that produced binary oppositional discourses that created a stark contrast between home and us and the people and places encountered who were positioned as other and them. A discourse provides a framework or lens through which to see the world. Discourses are therefore not neutral and can be used explicitly or implicitly to frame things to suit a particular purpose. Colonial discourses were produced first by explorers, closely followed by anthropologists, who viewed what they encountered through the lens of home and the ideas about European culture that they took to be the norm, as opposed to being one norm amongst many. This colonial discourse framed cultures encountered as exotic, savage, backward, uncivilized, uneducated, and so on. Anything that was opposite of the European characteristics. These characteristics were associated with the visible difference of skin color, and through Darwinian ideas of science and evolution, the idea of race as a biological distinction was established. Pennycook argues that the discourses that were produced through colonialism have had long-lasting effects in large domains of Western thought and culture, including education that was a key mechanism by which to use those same discourses to colonize Black, Brown, and Indigenous bodies and minds.
So the colonial project is both ontological and epistemological. The colonial project refers to the processes, events, and structures that happened at the time of the colonial spread across the world. The purpose of the project was to gain control of places outside of Europe for the benefit of European nations. Land was taken, either through direct or indirect rule. Institutions and systems were set up to ensure the perpetuation of the project. For example, legal systems that robbed Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island of their territories through biased treaties. Education institutions in the form of residential schools in Canada and Australia that were designed to eradicate Aboriginal ways of being and to replace them with white settler ways. And economic systems that used colonized bodies as slaves. Colonialism was therefore a totalizing project of ownership of minds, bodies, and land, using a way of thinking about the world that is referred to as coloniality. Coloniality, therefore, refers to the organization and systemic distribution of power through the control of access to knowledge and resources by the dominant group. It's what remains after political independence, an enduring and ongoing legacy. These long-standing patterns of power continue to define knowledge production, culture, labor, and intersubjective relations through what Gross-Vogel refers to as the colonial world system. And Gross-Vogel identifies 15 entangled global hierarchies that are inherent in the global system that put the European, Christian, patriarchal, white, heterosexual male characteristics of the colonizers on the superior side of the binary, and all the identity characteristics that were different to these on the inferior side, creating global hierarchies such as a racial ethnic hierarchy that privileges European over non-European peoples, a gender hierarchy that privileges males over females, a sexual hierarchy that privileges heterosexuals over LGBTQ+, a spiritual hierarchy that privileges Christians over non-Christian, non-Western spiritualities, an epistemic hierarchy that privileges Western knowledge over non-Western knowledges, a hierarchy, by the way, that's institutionalized in the global university system, and a pedagogical hierarchy, where Cartesian Western forms of pedagogy are considered superior over non-Western forms and practices of pedagogy. The pervasiveness of coloniality is that it also created a colonial mindset in the minds of the colonized. A colonial mindset is a form of internalized oppression that conditions colonized people to believe that their ethnic or cultural identity is inferior to Western culture or whiteness. Coloniality, therefore, sees its way of thinking and being as the only valid way of thinking and being, and as so superior that it must be a universal good. Colonial patterns of power function through a variety of controlling mechanisms, and it's these that we explore in the next slide.
So among others, colonial relations had two major interconnected effects: appropriation and erasure. Colonial forms of relation are shown in the first column, and the effects of these relations are in the second and third columns. We have already referred to some of the obvious violences of colonial relations, but colonial relations can also take place in ways that are not immediately visible, and we give some examples here. Some of them are examples of co-option of cultural resources from the global south, as opposed to the more obvious appropriations of land, agricultural, and mineral resources. Co-option becomes problematic when they are represented as neutral, and there is no acknowledgement of their cultural origins or the histories behind them. When these are omitted and made invisible, it is a form of erasure. For example, chesses from India. Chess pieces are black and white, and the white always goes first, so the white piece has an inherent advantage. Mindfulness, the term that is the rage at this moment, has its origins in Hinduism and Buddhism. The adult coloring books that are part of the commodification of mindfulness are based on the Hindu and Buddhist use of the mandala, which is a symbolic diagram used in the performance of sacred rites and is an instrument of meditation. In academia, posthumanism is based on many of the ideas that stem from indigenous knowledges, but these are repackaged and represented as a new Western idea. Similarly, research methods books are predominantly written by white Western male, and the concept of plurality, as it is explored in the Western Academy, draws on theoretical perspectives from Western scholars such as Jacques Derrida, Chantal Mouffe, Hannah Arendt. This effectively erases by omission the scholarship of academics from the global south in this area, including Gloria Anzaldúa, Bell Hooks, Artur Escobar, Chandra Mohanty, Rabindranath Tagore, and André Lode. Reflecting on these issues, we can ask ourselves, how are these relationships and hierarchies played out in the University of Regina and the Faculty of Education? How do I come into contact with this? And where am I complicit in this?
So among the many macro and micro aggressions, we've selected 3 examples of contemporary colonialism. In image 1, this is referring to the report of the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women, and it highlights the treatment of Canadian Indigenous persons as a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of a national group, with the aim of annihilating the group themselves. In image 2, 4 members of a family were killed when a driver that the police say targeted them because they were Muslim struck them with his car in London, Ontario last year. In image 3, Omar Mahmood was in grade 4 in Mississauga, Ontario, playing outside with another student when he scored a goal and the student called him a cheat. When he said he wasn't, the student responded, "Thank God, God didn't make me black like you." So colonialism, through coloniality, continues to have countless effects across societies, not least through the education system, as evident, for example, in universities and the lack of representation and promotion of BIPOC and other intersecting identities, in school system attainment gaps, and in institutional racism.
To summarize, we see these colonial discourses in education, amongst others, and a discourse of commodification of education which both objectifies and is dehumanizing. We see a discourse of universalism, where standardization using mainstream norms of criteria and the imposition of one-size-fits-all policies. We also see othering discourses treating difference as deviation from the mainstream norm, processes of naming and categorizing special ed, BIPOC, EAL, LGBTQ+, and the term diversity itself, to which we ask diverse from whom? The implication being diverse from the mainstream. These categories are the ones that get explicitly named, but is seen as not applicable to the white mainstream. Also look at the deficit discourses that position students in categories such as problem to be fixed or failure is individualized. It's the student's fault, their parents don't give enough support at home, etc., rather than it being the effect of a system that privileges the mainstream. Policies and practices aimed at fixing students who are perceived to have failed are based on paternalism and saviorism.
So it's our contention that the majority of teachers have been socialized into a teacher ontology or a way of being that is colonial. And one of the ways in which that is manifest is through a colonial mindset that then influences everything that we do as teachers and educators. That's not saying that it's people's fault, it's just the way that it is. The majority of us have been socialized into Western or westernized education systems and nations. Therefore, we believe it's essential to do the work of decolonizing that mindset and the ways of being and doing that flow from it. In other words, decolonization is as much an ontological process as it is an epistemological one. The question for educators, therefore, is how can we create spaces of belonging for all students in ways that do not mirror the othering processes of society? And perhaps more fundamentally, how can we become aware of the ways in which we are complicit in coloniality, which might be our blind spots? And De Souza Santos introduces the idea of abyssal thinking, which we find helpful in better understanding how coloniality works. He describes abyssal thinking, as a system consisting of visible distinctions, which are based on invisible distinctions, established through a logic that defines social reality as either on this side of the abyssal line or the other side of the abyssal line. His argument is that because of the universal, dominating, monological form that coloniality takes, coloniality can only see itself on this side of the abyssal line, and what exists on the other side of the line is completely obscure from it, because from within that way of thinking, it's almost beyond thinking to imagine that there might be a pluriversal world rather than a universal world. Whereas people who are on the other side of the abyssal line are very well able to see both sides of the line because they experience them on a daily basis. What we are arguing then is that if education is an instrument of colonial power, then education as it's conceived in the West and in westernized education systems is on the colonial side of the line, and finds it difficult to conceive of education in any other way than the way that it is. So, following Fanon, we construct this as symbolic and epistemic violence against the ways of being, knowing, and doing of those on the other side of the line. But this is not perceived as violence by those on the colonial side of the line. For example, the school's use of the Canadian flag image from their perspective is a perfectly reasonable image to use, but it's only reasonable because of the blindness to what's on the other side of the abyssal line, i.e. the invisible.
So what does it mean to de/colonize? First of all, why do we use a / between de and colonize? In this, we follow Bhattacharya, who uses the / to denote the lack of pure utopian decolonizing space, because we are always already in relationship with colonizing discourses and materiality. In our own work, we extend this to include a focus on critical relationality that is inclusive of both the epistemic and ontological dimensions of the relationship. From a pluriversal understanding of the world, there is no single or universal interpretation of what this means. But for us, and this is where we differ from other decolonial scholars in education, it means de/colonizing relationships. Relationality is at the heart of our approach, and in this we draw on Martin Buber's I-it and I-thou relations. Buber developed a three-part theory in which each part interrelates with the other. and is not a sequential thing, a twofold attitude, I, it, and I, thou, and life at a societal level and life at a spiritual level. So the I, it is a relation of experience and sensation. I stands in relation to it as an object that is separate from the self, which we either use or experience. The object of experience, the I, it, is viewed as a thing to be utilized, a thing to be known or to put to some purpose. There is a necessary distance between the experiencing of I and the experience of it, I, it. The one is subject and the other object. I, thou, on the other hand, is a spiritual relation. I stands in relation to thou, not through seeking, but through encounter. Encounter is actual life. It means suspending experiencing and just being instead. How can we stand in relation without experience? A thou relation in life with, it is not experience something as an object or with objective. It is not internal making sense of an object experience. It is a relation between subject with subject. It is reciprocal and emergent because it is without objective. Buber argues that thou is required for me to become I. It is a necessary process of differentiation. Once I become I, then I can say you or thou, like a baby becoming aware of separation between the self and the parent or caregiver. This is a pre-categorical understanding of difference, because difference is noted first before categories of I and you are created, after which point the two I, it, I, thou relationships develop. However, Buber argues that life at a societal level, including education, emphasizes the I-it relationships. For example, provincial curricula can be described as I-it because the objectives for learning are externally determined. Example, the curriculum which provides objectives for learning in specified curriculum areas. Example, art, English, math, science, geography, history, or social studies, music, and so on. While this might be necessary, an over-reliance on I-it is a curriculum of poverty, in the sense that it lacks potential richness that can come through attention to I-thou relationships that are life at a spiritual level. What these ideas mean for our praxis as educators is partly expressed through the questions on the right side of the slide. And it is these and more that we explore in our imaginary of d/colonizing educational relationships. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to us. We hope that you take something away from this lecture, and we will be putting together the second lecture for you to watch before the weekend retreat. Thank you. Goodbye.